My name is George Bina. It would be interesting maybe for you to see also what's under the hood for some of the functionality that we provide in Oxygen. And but then when I designed the slides and everything, I realized that it's not that I cannot explain it quite quickly, but I hope at least that I will give you the ideas, and then you can go and explore further if you want to see in more details how everything is actually done every step of the way. Because yeah, it will take too much time probably to go into each detail, but all these ideas share the same pattern, the same approach. So I wanted to show you how we implement it, for instance, in order to make Oxygen easier for people that do not know DITA or XML, or in general, we try to come up with, in the authoring side, with different ideas, different possibilities, like inline actions, so bringing actions in line in the user interface. Especially if you access the document with the web author on a mobile device, you know, it's not easy to have side views or toolbars available. So it's more simple if the actions are right there in the place in the document, and you can just tap on that, for instance. Then how can you help people learn incrementally? Because one of the big problems with XML is also generated by us, by the tools, with the too much support that we provide. Why? For instance, I've seen people comparing Markdown with XML and saying Markdown is easy and XML is difficult. But the problem is that when you start with Markdown, for instance, you know maybe three things. You know how to make a paragraph, a title, and the list, right? So that's basically what you know. And you find it easy because you do all those things. If you try to edit a DITA document in Oxygen and you press enter in author or start square bracket in the text mode, and you see 100 possibilities, you know, and you freak out, and it's, what's this? It's difficult, right? So the idea was to try to find, you know, ways, because Markdown is as difficult as the equivalent XML, because the difficulty is not necessarily in the way you encode that information, but what you want to encode, right? So inline hints is a way to try to help people incrementally understand, you know, or learn the language, or what they are supposed to do in for some elements, what they are supposed to enter in those elements. Then too much information at once, it's also a problem, so we try to play around with how do we create like splitting into tabs in the user interface and show, you know, when you press on a tab, you see some parts of the document and so on. And also another issue is if your document, XML document has a predefined order, how do you move some content in another part of the document that you're seeing? You know, that's also a challenge. So these are the parts that I want to show to you. So Inline Actions has a number of different implementations, but the first one that I've created was the idea that if I start with a document like a DITA task, for instance, and there are some elements already inserted in that document, between those elements are other elements, but I know that they are there, but I don't know where usually, you know. So it will be interesting to kind of see the virtual structure, the possible structure of the document and where that's available, and then be able to just click and instantiate the actual element at that place in the document. So let me show you, you know, let's go to Oxygen, and we have a task here. And one of the, so with the CSS that we have in Oxygen is not just one CSS. You can define multiple CSS styles. Like for DITA, for instance, we have, I don't know, 15, I don't know, 9, I think there are 7 main styles. So the ones in the front are like the main styles. You choose one of those. This is the important one, let's say. And the others are called alternate styles. And you can enable or disable those styles. So then you have 2 at power, the number of alternate styles multiplied with the main styles as different ways to see a topic. And for DITA, when I computed at some point, there were like 2,000 ways to view a DITA topic if you played with activated the different styles. So one of the styles is Inline Actions. And what happens is that you can see that we layer the virtual structure of the document on the actual document content. So basically what this says here is that between the title of the document and the short description, you can enter an alternative title, right? You may know there's an alternative title in DITA, for instance, but where is that, right? Or prologue versus prerequisites, for instance, and so on. Or for a step, you see that it's a command, but the hazard statement or the note can be inserted before the command, not after that. So in a way, it shows you from a single view, you know, kind of what's available there. And as you start playing with this, so if I click on this, it's enter title alternatives. Inside that, I can have a navigation title. If I enter that, I can enter the search title after that, or if I enter the search title, the navigation is before that. So I can basically instantiate or remove elements from the document, and I get this feeling. I know it was like a kind of an experiment to see, you know, how is that. And I think it's useful for people that get started with this type of document to understand. For instance, if I give you a troubleshooting document, you know, what can I do here? It's difficult to understand. But if you show you put inline actions on, and it's the first time you are working with this, you see, oh, I can enter a trouble solution here, whatever that is. I have alternative short descriptions. I have choices here. I have a remedy. I have, you know, so and you can click on this and see this has a cause, a remedy, and another trouble solution, and so on. So you can get an idea of the structure, and you can play just clicking and inserting those fragments. So now the thing is, how it's done? How can we do that? So water. I also need water when I'm speaking. So first thing is that all this is at the CSS level. So it's just a different view of the document. There's nothing changed in the source. The source is the same, you just have a different view of the document. And once you activate that view, which can be an alternate style, so you can combine that maybe with hints or some other ideas, then you get all this information.
How do you define what actually happens if you click something?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I will let you know. So the key to this was, you know, that there are basically like the CSS allow me to match, because this is done at the CSS level, right? I need to match on an element, let's say, and then decide which actions are maybe before that element or after that element that I can place. You know, what's missing from the document. And I can have different cases. So one case is if an element is empty, then that means inside that element there may be some child elements, right? So if an element is empty, I can generate on the after pseudo class, pseudo element, I can generate actions to insert the possible children of that element. Or if the element is the first child of a parent, then there may be missing elements that can be inserted before that element, right? So if my CSS determines, I don't know, that the short description is the first child of a topic, it's not the first child. I don't know, a different case. In the navigation title, that in the alternative titles, that the search title is the first child. Before that, there may be a navigation title. All right. So that I need to generate an action that says insert navigation title and so on. Another example is if an element is the last child, then maybe after that there are still more elements allowed in the parent, and I can generate actions to insert those. And the general case is that if I have an element 2 immediately following element 1, between these there may be other elements that can be inserted. So that's the main idea basically. So, and these 4 patterns, they match what's available in CSS basically, because in CSS you can match and say an element column empty, that means if this element is empty, or you have column first child, column last child to check if an element is the last child or first child, and also you can have parent that has an element immediately followed by another element, right? So these are the rules that you can play with, and this is the element that you match, right? So before that we can generate this, after that we can generate these actions and so on, right? So that's the main idea. So then so from an implementation point of view, we need to create a CSS. We can define this as an alternate style that we can just switch on or off. And then Oxygen provides support. Christy, I think, mentioned for the PDF chemistry for different levels of before or after. That was a draft in the CSS4 specification at some point ago. I haven't seen that document anymore, but we implemented that, and it's quite useful because it avoids exponential growth of the number of possible rules and things like that. Because you can, rather than saying before, you can say before 100 or before 101, 102, 103, right? So you can have different before pseudo elements that do not interact with each other. So then you can separate and generate, you know, each action, let's say, on a different layer. So they will not interfere. Otherwise, I need to say, oh, but if I have 2 elements, and you know, and I get into an exponential growth of different possibilities. Think, for instance, if you have like 3 attributes on an element, and you want to do different things based on the combination of those attributes, but you do not care actually when one attribute is present about the other 2. But still, if you have a single before, you need to match whether it's 1 attribute or 2 or 3, and based on that, you know, generate different content. While with different before layers, we say before 4 is for the first attribute. So if the element has the first attribute, before 4 we do something. We print its value. The other attributes is before 3, and then we have one rule for each attribute. We don't need to think about, you know, if they are all 3, none, just 1, 2, and so on. So to take all the combinations, which is 2 at power n. And then so once I created basically a prototype that, for instance, for title alternatives, if that's empty, then on an after layer like 311 or whatever a number, in the content we have the possibility to use 4 controls or actions. So either like a drop down to edit an attribute or an action. So we can generate those actions rather than in the framework in that visual way. We can specify them in the CSS with the function. So then on the content property, I can add a button that we use the same operations that you can invoke in the, as Alex presented, the insert fragment operation, for instance. And then we can insert this fragment in the document. So I can define the action already here. So the first idea and how I approached this was I kind of lay down that idea which rules I can use in the CSS to generate actions, and then I manually generated the CSS with some actions to see how that works, you know. But then for the actual data with all the elements, it's very difficult to do that by hand. So that needs to be generated, right? So, but once you have the CSS and you know what you need to generate, it's very easy to kind of just define an XML structure or whatever that will generate what you need. So that's, so I created basically an XML descriptor file that just defines the content model of the element that you want to model, right? Like for title alternatives, so I have some attributes to model. The long name is the label that you see, so you don't see nav title or search title, but you can see something else. And then the number of occurrences is optional, or you can put star or plus, or one or more, and based on that, then I play with what's actually generated to make that, you know, like a required or. Let me try to show you. So you see, the step is required basically, so I can also use a different background for that to indicate that this is required. And within Oxygen, if you go inside the frameworks, DITA, CSS actions, then you can see the actions descriptor basically for everything that we have for DITA, you know. And here you can see we can also control a bit the fragment. So by default, if you don't specify the fragment, we insert an element, empty element, a source element in this case, or in that case we insert the nav title element or the search title element. But if you want to be more specific, then for the copyright element, we can generate also content inside. So that action, inline action that inserts a fragment, we'll use this fragment if it's present in the configuration file. Yeah, so I try to put also the content model here, and then the XML part, you know, kind of mirrors that. And you have here the style sheets. Generate actions XSL is the style sheet, so you can use a similar approach. You can define, you know, for your own, for pmod, for instance, we can just define such a configuration file, run that XSLT script, and we obtain the CSS. We use that as an alternate style, and then we have similar functionality for pmod, right? And for any XML framework. So I try to split here, there are two perspectives. So basically the developer's perspective is that the idea that you need to imagine how that will work, basically, create a prototype, and then provide the way to generate that. But from a user perspective, things are a lot simpler. Because in this case, you can just look over an existing configuration file, you know, adapt that to your actual needs, and then run the script to generate the CSS and just use that. So it's a lot easier to use this functionality for your own purpose, right? The idea of inline actions is implemented further for lightweight DITA, for Saxon configuration files, and for DITA file filters, and probably also for others. For Saxon configuration files, for instance, let me show you. So for Saxon configuration file, there's a different style sheet. So you see here, I can see the sections in the configuration file. Like I have a global section, and then when I insert that, I get all the global parameters that I can set for Saxon. And here I have different values. I don't know, many are Boolean, but maybe some others. Some others may have other values, and we collect them from the schema. So all the CSS in this case is generated from the Saxon schema, right? So rather than having this content model, we run the style sheet over the schema, and then we generate this kind of user interface to allow users to, you know, access this section, for instance, and then you see all the possible elements there, and you can define values and so on. So yeah, so that's another example of using this a similar idea, but in this case the style sheet is applied directly on the schema rather than having this configuration file. For lightweight DITA, I choose a different approach. It's like you have this plus, you click on that, this expands. Here you have, you know, a number of actions, and then you have like a more, so you can insert additional. And once you choose an action, then everything collapses, closes, right? So it's like you open something, you select it, it goes back. It's similar with the, if you are familiar with the medium.com, it's a kind of like an article writing platform or something like that. They provide a similar user experience, but I wanted to see, you know, can we do that in the web author with some customization of the CSS? Yes, you can, you know, and you can find this in the lightweight DITA customization that you find in the DITA framework in Oxygen. Another example is the DITA filter. So here you can add a filter and then a flag. So the actions are in these drop downs basically. And what's interesting here is that so this is an approach like a drop down, or you see what's available, select something and it's entered. But this does also something quite interesting in the sense that if you select the format, you know, the styles are applied directly. So if the text is white and the background is maroon, you know, you get an instant rendering within the document itself. So I included these examples, you know, these pointers, so you can, if you want, you can go to those frameworks and see a bit more on how those are created. So next, if we look at inline hints, so I have this for the lightweight DITA. That's a more interesting part, I think. Like you have the short description here, but once you are with the mouse over the short description, you get this information button. And if you click on this, then you see some information about what you are supposed to do there. Or if you insert like the definition list, then you have the information button here, and you can instruct the user, you know, what they are supposed to do within that new element that they inserted. This is an HTML fragment. It can contain links to other resources. It can contain lists, tables, whatever. Highlights, multiple paragraphs, and so on. So you can have, you know, different information there. It's not just a static text that is displayed. Yeah, so I have screenshots in the slides, because when the slides are made available, you know, someone that will look over the slides should be able to understand, you know, maybe just looking over the slides, they may not have the demo in front of them. So the technology that we use here is the support for form controls. And we have the button that we click on to show or hide the hints. And the HTML form control that allows to render an HTML fragment within the document. Again, we use multiple before-after pseudo elements, because if I only had a before element and I use that for inline actions, then, you know, that will interfere then with the hints. If I try to use hints, present hints on the before pseudo element, right? So that's why another reason why the multiple before elements are quite useful, because when you enable different alternate style sheets, the chances of them to interact with each other are a lot lower. Let's say unless you basically use the same layer, before layer or after layer. And another thing that we are using here is something that's support for custom pseudo classes. So let's say when you go with the mouse over an element, you know that the browser will activate the hover pseudo class. So then you can put different styles, like an underline when you move the mouse, or change the color. So the color will light up that element or something like that. In Oxygen, you can also, so we support this, but you can also define your own pseudo classes and control them with different actions, right? So what happens basically here is that when I click on this I button, what I do is I change a pseudo class on the short disk. A pseudo class is like a flag, like an attribute with true-false value attached to an element, but is not serialized in the XML model. It's just, it's transitory, let's say. It will disappear, it's part of the view. And it's available only when you look at the document, right? That's basically a pseudo class. And these pseudo classes allow us to create this different behavior, basically, because I can trigger them when the user does a specific action, and then I can match on the CSS, saying column, and then that pseudo class, column hints, for instance, right? So if I turn on the hints pseudo class, when I press on the action, then short description, shortest column hints will match. And then on that, I can say before 100, I have this HTML content. When the hints pseudo class is off, then that rule does not match and the HTML content disappears. So that's how the dynamic part basically works. But in order to make this easy for users to actually use it, we use, in this case, a less library. A similar approach with what Alex presented. So basically what he showed is that you can have something like the word library of styles, like heading, titles, code blocks, and so on, and you just associate those styles to element names, right? And then you render the P mode in a specific way. In this case, we hide the implementation part in a less library. So then, from the user perspective, they just declare that they want hints for some elements. So, so this is the user perspective basically for Lightweight DITA. I say for topic title I want hint, for prologue I want a hint, for these elements I want a hint. That's all I need to do. And within an HTML file, we have this. Actually, we just care about the ID to be hints minus and the element name, for instance, right? So once you define a fragment in that HTML file, and then you declaratively say, I want hints for the short description, that's all you need to do from a user perspective. You just say, I want hints for this, and then you need to have the content in the HTML file, in the corresponding HTML file. Just to get an idea, inline hints. So here's the HTML file, which basically you can organize in whatever way you want. You just need to define the ID attribute for the div that you want, like hint section. So this will be the content that will go on a section if I have hints on section and so on. And then the less file, yeah, so this is the entire part that defines the hints. I added also something like mark section with the label. So the sections that have this, basically, they have like this short description. That's the label for, so when I have something here, if I click, it says short description as a label before that. Basically, if I remove the mark section part, I do not have that behavior anymore. So you see, it's without the short description before that. So it's an additional functionality, let's say. While we are here, you may also observe that the element names are called definition list, definition term, and so on, while in the document they are DL, DT entry, and DD, and so on. So we have like human readable labels for those elements rather than the element names. And also if you want to insert a new, it says definition list rather than something else. So how that is done, this is just a side note because I was talking with, I don't know, I was talking to someone, yeah, with you earlier, how that is done. Well, basically Oxygen has a configuration file where you can just say render DL as definition list. So that's basically one line that will say will have that effect that DL will always be presented as definition list, for instance. So you can use this to remap basically the actual XML elements to something else for the users. Maybe for the users that are not that familiar with the language. Oxygen still allow you, if you know the element name and type DL, it will select the definition list. So it's not that if you know that was actually a challenge because when we discussed this, but what if someone actually knows DITA and types DL? They will not be able to find the actual element. So we took that into account. So even if you know the actual element name, it will still work, right? Yes.
If you want to do this in separate languages, is it possible just to have a kind of language switcher, or do we have to have different frameworks for that?
You added a lang support for this?
Yes.
Yeah, so in the
rendering element, you see the closing tag at the bottom of the
No, I don't see it in the moment.
So the bottom. So all these render elements are nested in an element rendering. So element, so this element has a long attribute. I think.
Okay, cool.
maybe in
Something.
yeah.
Maybe the DCT is not updated.
We added this for the web author basically.
Multiple entries for various languages.
Okay.
Actually, I think by default we have
But it will be in 2021. It's not generally available in 20.1 right now. It will be in the next release, right?
I think it's already.
I don't know. I don't know. But it's there. It will be there. With those pseudo classes, we also can do something like Alex presented. So when you press on a button, you turn a pseudo class that says edit mode or something like that. And when you match on the edit mode, then you can place different attributes, for instance. And then when you say done, you turn off the edit mode pseudo class, and then so that really helps, to keep render things, in a compact form. But when you want to enter in edit mode only on a specific section, you can expand that and provide more options to the user. So that's also implemented in the lightweight DITA part. And Yeah, so if you explore the library and the less file in the Lightweight DITA framework, then you can see all those parts basically. So in this case, let me see if I have. Yeah, so the hint basically uses the HTML content form control to display from an HTML file an element with a specific ID, which in this case is concatenated for the category, which by default is hints, minus, and then the local name hints minus short description, hints section, hints definition, DL, and so on. So that's how this is implemented, and yeah. And similarly, we have this idea. So initially, the hints were implemented a bit differently in the DITA framework. We implemented them there as a layer. So, like you can go to styles and say hints, and then you get hints for all the elements, and as you see now they are combined with the inline actions, or you can take off the inline actions and you get only the hints. But I was finding this approach with the on-demand hints, basically in the information button, more useful, I think, because they do not clutter the user interface so much. So you just request them for the elements that you don't know, let's say. And also the Saxon configuration file that you've seen earlier, the Saxon schema is documented, and then we can generate from the annotations in the schema for each of the elements in the configuration file, so xquery, inherit namespaces, right? And then we get the documentation from the schema as a hint here, right? So yes.
After running all those style sheets and creating the less files, and after reading the less files and compiling the resulting CSS files, those are massive. If you do all those inline actions, hints, etc., so doing this manually is a no-go.
Yes, of course. No.
So, but what about performance? So in case you have a document which kind of is a DITA map with all the reference topics inlined, like a full book inside the editor, and then you switch on such a feature, is that a realistic use case? Does this work? Or will I have to wait 20 seconds until everything is rendered?
Oh. Well, so there are two things. Two things to take into account. So this action CSS is almost 3 megabytes. So it's quite large, and it works okay in the DITA. So we haven't seen any visible issue with that. And the second thing is that if you generate, I could have generated for DITA from the schema, because the schemas are now in Redux NG, or even from the DTD, I could have processed that and generate all the content models and everything, but it will be too much, for the user. So that's why usually I choose, the main content models, let's say. I don't go within a paragraph and show that you have 120 inline options, because it will be too much clutter and it will not make sense. Right, so you need to play with this and do not use it necessarily for everything that's available in the schema, but for the main parts that you want to present to the user. Also for the lightweight DITA, I just show like 7 actions or 10 actions, not everything that's possible, like 50, right? Because then you will get into the problem that users will perceive that it's too complex and that's exactly opposite to the point that you want to make, right? So. But I was also surprised that, that CSS is actually 97,000 lines of CSS. And it was, I didn't notice any performance issue. So anyway. So let me show you something else. Well, I think probably the link. Yeah, I no. Oh, don't worry. So the project is AX. So we have a project on GitHub where I try to play with, so let me show you first. I think there's a URL that allows me to open this. So on a DITA task, basically I wanted to show some of the content of the task in different tabs rather than one after the other. This was over my phone. For some reason, the network didn't work after the lunch break. So you can see here, that you have the prerequisites, context, steps, and the rest of the elements. So then I can switch on a tab. I was thinking that it's cool to have something like that. And how can you do that, right? So, and also here there are code blocks in different languages like Java, C++, or XML, let's say. And then you can have them in different tabs, right? So then you can focus on the context, on prerequisites. So especially when you have a very large document and you want the user maybe to split this into 4 or 5 different sections, and they should focus on these, maybe on metadata, and then on something, and then on something, and then on something, then it may be easier to use something like that. Now, so the behavior is that some parts of the document are hidden, and you see only some elements in the document. It looks like there are tabs there, but actually what's under the hood is that we play again with the pseudo classes. So each tab basically triggers a pseudo class. And when that, like tab 1, tab 2, tab 3, tab n, let's say, pseudo classes. And when tab 1 is active, the other are disabled. When tab 2 is active, the other are disabled, and so on. So when I click on prerequisites, basically I have an action that will enable tab 1 and will disable all the others. When I click on context, tab 2 will be enabled and tab 1 will be disabled, and so on, right? On the parent element. And then what I do is that I display none. I set display none on everything except for tab 1, for instance, I have the prerequisites. And for that I have a display block. For tab 2 I have context. So when tab 2 is enabled, the pseudo class context has display block. The rest have display none. And then you get this behavior like there are actual tabs, and you put in each tab as a container different content. So the behavior is like that, but within that, what happens is that we dynamically hide or we dynamically show one element. And with the last tab, we show the other elements. From a user point of view, what you need to do basically is something like this. So you say tab with others, and you have the first element, the second element, the last element, and then you provide the labels for each of those tabs, and then the label for the others. So the elements that you have not, say, specified here, you will be rendered in the last tab. Or you can have only tabs, and then this will not show the other elements at all. So you will only present these n elements with those labels as the tabs, but the rest will be gone. Will not be visible at all if there are other elements. And in this case, basically we match on the task body, and then we say tabs with others prereq, and we use a prerequisites label context, and use this label steps, and use this label, and more for the rest of the elements that are in the task body. So that's what is required from a user point of view to create that behavior, right? And that's actually great about using this approach that I mentioned, where you basically imagine something, and then you have some work on the development part, so because you need to think in your mind how that may work. But once you develop the prototype and then you validate your assumption that your ideas actually work and you can do it, then, you know, if you write a list file or an XSLT script and provide a configuration file, then from a user perspective, things are quite easy. Because the user will just need to edit the list file in a declarative way, say, I want hints, or I want tabs, and for the tabs, you know, I want prereq, steps, and this element. And okay, others will be in this label, under this label. So it's quite easy from a user perspective to actually use this after that. So yeah, so for this is how the code block part works. So in this case, we use only tabs, not tabs with others. We say, you know, we have a Java tab where we put the code block that has an output class containing language Java and so on. So that's and let me see if we can go. So again, we use the custom pseudo classes, inline actions to control the pseudo classes, and we use less to generate the CSS. So the custom pseudo classes are oxyvisible -1, oxyvisible 2, oxyvisible 3, and so on. And you can see how. So you see, we say if the task body has oxyvisible 1 set, all the child elements of task body will be hidden, display none. But then if we have oxyvisible 1 and it's a prereq element as the child of the task body, then the display is block, right? And this is more a specific rule, and it will activate with priority over the one with the star. So this will win for prereq, for instance, right? So prereq will be block, but the rest will be display none. And then for the third tab, again we say steps has a display block. And then when you click on the tabs, we just play with the, you know, like if you click on the prerequisites, then we enable visible 1, but we remove visible 2, visible 3, and visible 4, for instance, right? So that's the idea. And all this is not written manually. It's generated by those 4 lines of list. So you just say, I want to have tabs, and here are the elements and the labels. That's it. And the CSS is generated. The last example, and I will finish with that. So on GitHub, so the journal of TEI, I implemented, they had notes. And the idea was, those notes are usually on the side or as footnotes, or, you know, so say they should not be within the document content. And so basically, Oxygen also provides support for absolute and fixed positions. So then you can take a content from the actual document workflow and put that maybe to be sticky at the top of the page or on the side, right? So this is what I use in this case to move the notes on the side, and we use also these custom pseudo classes to hide and show them. So when I press on this button, I turn on or off a pseudo class that makes the notes visible or hidden. So in the actual document, the notes are within the content, but in this case, they are extracted on the side. And another interesting part here is like this. So let's say these are overlapping nodes, and we can use the Z order to basically bring into context one node or the other. You see, depending where I'm with the mouse, I can bring them in front, which is quite interesting. So you can basically edit also here, directly on this side. If we look into the source, I don't know. You can see that the note element is actually within the content here, right? So, but it's moved on the side by this. So basically, what we use here is that we use position absolute and right and width to control the and Z index to, we say it's 1 on a node, but if you are with the mouse over, it's 10. So we bring that to front, right? So that's the trick to have that behavior. What's interesting is that you get this, like with 2 lines. So although the implementation may look complex, in reality it's quite easy and simple. So I hope I gave you some ideas where to look. You will find the URLs on the slides. After the meeting, this will be available on our website. So then you can go and explore more if you find, some interesting ideas and you want to have something similar. Especially that some of those can be used. Also the library that Alex created. So once you have the library, the user perspective is quite simple. So you don't need necessarily to get into all the technical details behind that. You can just take the user's perspective part and use that play with that and see how it works, and then use it for your project. So thank you, and let's have a short break.